Right, okay. Good evening. This evening we have with us Mr. Tom O'Connor, who is the Chief Executive of Providence Row, the homeless charity, who was supported by our circle via the President's Charity last year, and who we donated funds by electronic funds transfer because he couldn't be present to receive a check from us. Tom has very kindly agreed to come along and talk to us this evening to outline some of the challenges the charities are facing in their work, and also what practical help we may be able to give going forward. Tom has kindly agreed to let us record his session and also to take some questions towards the end. So with no more ado, over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be able to join you this evening. And if you forget everything else I say, which may be quite likely, please remember just two words, and the two words are thank you. Because the support that you have given us as Catenians over this last year is really, really important to us. And it's great for me to have the opportunity, as much in person as we're able to at the moment, to say thank you directly. Sometimes letters and emails are just not the same. So that's what I really want to say. Thank you for the invitation this evening, but most especially thank you for supporting Providence Row, and thank you for your prayers, which really mean a great deal to us. I promised you that I won't speak for too long. I'll be fairly brief, just so there's plenty of opportunity for you to ask any questions that you would like to, or to make any comments that you would like to make. What I'll do, just for those who don't know Providence Row already, I'll just very briefly say who we are at Providence Row, where we've come from, what we do at the moment. Then I'll say a few words about our response since the pandemic and some of the challenges that we faced. And then finally, I'll just say a few words about the challenges that lie ahead for us and the uncertainty around at the moment. And very happy to pick up in more detail on any of those areas afterwards if you'd like to raise questions. So Providence Row, we were set up in 1860. By Father Daniel Gilbert, who was the parish priest of St Mary Moorfields, and he set up a refuge on a very small road behind his presbytery, which was called Providence Row. And it was a refuge initially for destitute women who had nowhere else to go and who had no support. Father Daniel invited the Sisters of Mercy over from Ireland, and they ran the charity for more than 100 years. So back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were many families that were kept together and saved from the workhouse because of the work of Father Daniel Gilbert and the Sisters of Mercy. So that was 160 years ago. It's our anniversary this year of the pandemic. And our work really is to continue what was done back in 1860 and what's continued ever since. We are built on what we now call the social teaching of the Catholic Church. That phrase probably wouldn't have been used back in 1860 very much, but the reality was very much part of the church and very much part of our faith then. We work on the belief that every individual has dignity and should be treated with respect, and that we have a particular responsibility to serve Christ in those who are most vulnerable. That's what we're about, and we have the honour of having done that for the last, 160 years now. So what does that look like in practice? So we work with those who are the most vulnerable amongst the homeless. So the people who are least likely to access other services and most in danger of destitution now. And I can go into a bit more detail later on in terms of the profile of many of our clients, if that's helpful. But what we believe is that it's not just about providing services for people. It's not just about ticking boxes in terms of people having a house or having a job. Or having physical or mental health care treatment. It's about working with every individual and recognizing the uniqueness of every individual. And to do that in a way that's appropriate, we accompany them on a journey of support. We walk with them as they make their journey to long-term recovery. We'll meet them at their moment of greatest crisis, and we'll stay with them until they decide that they no longer need our services. And that's basically what our 5-year strategy and our 160-year strategy has been all about. So what does that actually look like in practice? What do we actually do? Well, prior to the pandemic, we would have said we have two areas to our services, and they are interrelated. I won't give you the details of all of them, but just some examples. So within the first area, we call crisis response. Basically, we will work with people, whether they have just come off the streets today, whether they are suffering the effects of drug and alcohol today, whether they are in dire need of support right now. Whatever their current situation is, they're welcome to come to us for support. And we provide a range of services for them in that moment. So, for example, we provide a drop-in centre where people can come straight off the streets, where they can have breakfast, they can have a shower, and they can have an individual triage session to look at what their particular needs are. And from that meeting, we would refer them to other services, either within Providence Row or externally. So that's one part of our immediate crisis response. We also have a drug and alcohol outreach service, which goes out onto the streets, works in the hostels, and more recently in the hotels, to support people affected by substance misuse and to support them on their journey into recovery and to treatment. And that's a service that we've been running now for the last 10 years. And also, as part of our crisis response, we run what's called Routes to Roots, which is a hospital discharge service. So when people are being discharged from hospital and are in danger of becoming homeless, we will work with them to look at their options around housing and longer term support. So that's the first side of what we do, immediate crisis support when people are in imminent danger right now. The second and related area is what we call recovery and progression. So once people have addressed their immediate moments of crisis, and maybe they're off the streets or they've moved into treatment for substance misuse, what's needed to accompany them on their journey to long-term support so they can look to the future with hope and so that they can flourish for the long term. And so there's a whole range of services that we provide as part of that recovery and progression. So basically there are lots of groups where people can come along. There are music groups, there's English groups, there's IT groups, we provide massage, we provide homeopathy, a whole range of opportunities for people to get back in touch with themselves and get back in touch with their talents, the things that are positive about their lives that have got nothing to do with homelessness. And that's a really important part of people continuing their journey to recovery. We also provide a whole range of training and support for people who are looking to move back into work, to develop new skills and to gain qualifications. So we have, for example, a roof garden, and we provide a 12-week City and Guilds accredited course for people to learn about horticulture and to move into employment. Through our kitchen, we train people in baking and in cooking and in kitchen hygiene, again to help people to move on to work and to develop new skills in working with other people. We also have a social enterprise called Rise, which bakes brownies and sells them into the large corporations and government departments in the city. And those brownies are all made by our clients. And I won't go into lots of detail on that now, but it's really inspiring to go back to our clients and say, do you know what, I've just come back from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office where they are buying the brownies that you made. You do matter, you do have dignity. It's not just about a house and it's not just about money. And you can see people's faces light up when they realise the difference that they're making. And the last thing I'll mention, because I think it's quite important around our service provision, is we have quite groundbreaking outreach psychotherapy service, where our therapists actually go out onto the streets, into the hostels, into cafes and churches and elsewhere to provide psychotherapy for those who are homeless or in danger of homelessness, who have got serious mental health issues. And that's an area of our work that we're looking to grow. So in a nutshell, in each year we would serve something like about 1,800 clients through a whole range of different services and at different points on their journey to recovery. And that's kind of a nutshell of, if I was talking to you before the pandemic, that would have been a really quick helicopter view of what we do. And then, the same as everybody else in the world, back in March, we obviously went into lockdown. We had to close our day centre to group work. And initially even to people coming off the streets individually who are homeless. And it was interesting. So I was talking to somebody recently and I said, as an organisation, If we had plans to make the changes that we made within the space of a few weeks, we probably would have taken a year to do it. We'd have had all sorts of budgets, we'd have had an IT plan, we'd have had consultants and all the rest of it. And in fact, we kind of had to run out of the office with broken laptops and make it work, which I think is quite a good lesson for us going forward. But I'm really pleased to say, and I'm quite proud of my colleagues actually, in terms of what it's been possible to do during this time. So we kept our day centre open until the very last moment in which it was possible to do that. So I think we were the last day centre for homeless people, as far as I'm aware, that was open in London, certainly in East London. And then immediately after we closed our day centre, we continued our crisis response through hotels, through hostels, out on the streets, and through virtual support as well. And just to give you a few, I don't know if highlights is the right word, but examples of what we have done since March. So we ran 3 of the hotels in East London for people who were taken off the streets in the government scheme and brought into hotels. We'd never ever done that. To the best of my knowledge, in 160 years, we've not done that kind of work. So we had to set that up from scratch with risk assessments, managing behaviour, ensuring food, ensuring medical provision, ensuring people could self-isolate, ensuring people got all the treatment they needed if they were found positive with COVID-19. So that was a really new experience for us that we had to learn from very quickly. And as a consequence of that work, there are now just over 100 people who were rough sleeping in East London who are now in housing and have a recovery plan. So it's actually brilliant to have been part of that, and that's a significant step forward in the dark days of the pandemic that was possible. We also continued our outreach psychotherapy service. Initially, that was done remotely, but then later on, with appropriate PPE and so on, we were able to continue that service face-to-face on the streets, in our hotels, and in other hostels as well. So that's continued throughout the pandemic. And our drug and alcohol service has also continued all the way through the pandemic. And we've had some brilliant staff actually who have continued to work face-to-face with people right from the beginning, at a time when people really didn't know how the virus would spread or what risk they're putting themselves into. So again, I just pay great tribute to my colleagues who continued that work. We couldn't continue any of our group work, and we still can't do that right now, but we did set up a new telephone support service for all those who were accessing our learning and training programs before the pandemic, just to keep in touch with them, to look at any issues they had around isolation, and also to provide them with resources to ensure they didn't become lonely. And I'll just mention one more example, which we brought back quite recently, and that's our employability service, because it's really important now that we work with those who are vulnerable to homelessness going forward and who don't have access to funds. So we now have up and running again through the hostels and through other centres around East London, an employability service to help homeless people write CVs, prepare for job interviews, and link up with contacts that we have. So that, in a really quick nutshell, that's what we've been doing since the pandemic response. It's been incredibly intense, sometimes quite stressful, as I think it has been for all people. But I think there's been a really positive story to be told as well in terms of the outcomes for some very vulnerable people. And I'll just finish now by just very briefly mentioning some of the challenges as I see them that we're now facing, and you may wish to ask me a bit more about this. I mentioned a few moments ago that more than 100 people who were rough sleeping are now in accommodation and now have their recovery plans, and that's a great story to tell. The negative side, or the challenging side, is that we're seeing a pattern of new rough sleepers coming onto the streets since the beginning of the pandemic, and those people are very vulnerable. And the resources that were there at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of available housing and government funding is just not there at the moment. So those people, if anything, are at more risk than the people who came off the streets at the beginning of the pandemic. And the particularly vulnerable group are those who are here in the country perfectly legally, but have no recourse to public funds. And many of those people lost their jobs in hospitality at the beginning of the pandemic, and they are now being seen on the streets and are really in danger of destitution this winter. So that's a real focus for us with our employability programme. And just the last thing I mention is obviously we're now moving into the winter months. And Providence Row, along with other organisations, usually provides additional severe weather provision for people who are out in the cold during those coldest nights. We're in discussion with local authorities and others at the moment about how best to do that. But with current restrictions, it's very difficult to know how we're going to get people off the streets and at the same time be respectful of the COVID-19 restrictions. So that's a real challenge for us. We will work it through and we'll find a way through it. But it's something that's there for us at the moment as to consider very carefully. And just before I stop, I'll finish where I began, which is to say thank you very much. Your contribution of £1,500 has really made a big difference to us. And Hugh mentioned earlier, it might be worth saying something about what that kind of money could do. And there are lots of examples. The one I'd give you that strikes me most immediately is that during these months, we have needed to find money to provide people with food when they weren't getting that provision through temporary accommodation or places that they'd found to stay. And they were just hungry. There were people hungry on the streets because there was nobody to ask for food when London became pretty deserted. So the money that you've given us has enabled us to provide food for people at very short notice alongside the wider food provision that we offer. That's made differences in ways that you perhaps never know and I won't know, but it really, really matters. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening. I'll stop there, Hugh, in case there's any questions or comments that people would like to make.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. That was great. Now, I'm quite sure there will be some questions. Finding out if anybody got a question, would you like to put your hand up and I will try and find you.
Well, what I'll do, Hugh, while people think about a question, if I could ask Tom myself, you mentioned about the money that we raised, 1,500. Is there anything else that's a non-monetary item? I mean, I've put down here blankets, towels, quilts, and clothes. Are they items that you'd be looking for as well?
Yeah, no, it's interesting you should ask that because Hugh asked exactly the same question earlier today. And at the moment, our particular need is for very specific food items because we're providing a food provision now for healthy meals for rough sleepers and for people in temporary accommodation. So there's actually a list of very specific ingredients which we're looking for at the moment, and Hugh's got that. I know Hugh was intending to circulate that, but it's examples of things like tinned cans of tomatoes, pasta, rice, lentils, olive oil, tomato puree. That's specifically what we need. What we're not able to do at the moment with all of the restrictions around COVID-19 is take general donations of a whole range of other things. So a number of things we've now got under control, but the specific need is for particular food items to help with our food provision. And if any of yourselves could help with that, that would be very much appreciated. We would need to arrange when delivery could be taken of those just because of restrictions and so on, but anything you could do in that regard would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Bishop John, you're on mute.
Can you unmute yourself?
There we are. Thank you. Tom, thank you very much. Stimulating presentation. A few years since we met.
Nice to see you again, Bishop John.
60 years of legacy, which is incredible. I suppose there's two thoughts that come to mind just about the present pandemic, because I've been listening to Bishop Paul McAleenan talking about the number of extra people on the streets, the number of people losing their jobs, etc. So I suppose the first question is, to what extent you may be cooperating with other charities to try to ensure the provision. And I'd hope it's cooperation rather than competition. And I suppose secondly, regarding the night shelters, what's the system there? I mean, is there work with the local authorities who are trying to help or not?
Okay, no, that's really helpful, Bishop John, and it's really good to see you again. So with regard to working with other charities, absolutely, we are explicitly clear that we do not work in competition with other charities. Our competition is those who make people homeless. It's not other charities. Anyone who's supporting others to get off the streets and find a future are our friends, not our competitors. So we work very closely with other charities in London around shared provision. So we would be very open in referring people to services of other charities when that's most appropriate, and they do the same for us. And I've spent quite a lot of time during this pandemic talking to other chief executives exactly about how we can work together. And I don't pick up any sense of competition whatsoever, and that's genuinely the case. With regard to local authorities, I'd never worked directly with local authorities before I came to Providence Row and wondered what that might be like in practice. In fact, in the City of London and in Tower Hamlets, where we work predominantly, the relationship is very, very good. So we were commissioned by the local authority to run the hotels, for example, that we did, and we have a very close working relationship. And my experience of them is that they genuinely care and they generally want to do their best within quite difficult restrictions. We can't do our job without working with local and national government. It's not possible to find the solutions in isolation, and it's not appropriate either. So those partnerships are much stronger now than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And then finally, with regard to night shelters, what happens in practice is that we and other charities would work alongside the local authority and see what provision there is for night shelters, how that can be supported, and also where are the gaps in relation to that. So when we provide a severe winter provision, it's usually for the people who are most vulnerable. So they may have been excluded from night shelters because of behaviour, because of alcohol or drug issues and so on. And we've got the staff qualified to be able to deal with those challenging incidents. So we would see ourselves as working alongside and complementing those. The challenge at the moment is that the night shelters are not allowed to open. Obviously because of COVID-19, and we think that may not be possible during these winter months, but that's not yet 100% clear. So what we've been doing in practice alongside the local authority is to look at freeing up capacity within hostels where there are emergency rooms and so on, and actually bringing people into that environment. So it's not yet concluded, it's not yet sorted out, but it's very much a discussion, and it's a discussion between partners who want to address this issue. It's not a competition thing. And I would say the churches play a massive role in this, or have done historically up to now, before the pandemic. And those of no faith and those of other communities very much respect the night shelters that are provided by churches and other faith communities. It really, really does matter. So as soon as we can get those up and running again, the better. I don't know if that answers your question, Bishop John.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I got a question.
One that occurred to me, Tom, was to ask you, a lot of people were sort of swept off the street and put into hotels. But from what you just said then, did I gather that they might have handed you a building, but it was up to you to manage it and run it?
It was, but they also, we provided the expertise to manage it and run it. So they paid for the hotels and they gave us financial provision to support that work. But we had to run it, yeah, absolutely. And that was 24/7.
And that came to an end, presumably, did it?
That came to an end. The last of our hotels closed on the 11th of October. So we were running the hotels since March, yeah.
Right.
Could I ask what's happened to people having been thrown out of those hotels? What's the practical way of taking this forward? You know,
Yes, so up to now, the people have moved on from our hotels. They weren't thrown out as such. They would have been moved on to other options around accommodation. So the vast majority of those people would have gone into temporary accommodation. So whilst they were in the hotels, we would have ensured that they were provided with physical healthcare support, mental health care support, referrals for treatment around substance misuse, regular meals and so on, to get their strength back up, as well as looking at housing options for them. So some of those people will have moved on to supported accommodation, some will have moved into hostels, but all of them who moved out of our hotels did have some accommodation option when they left. We were really clear. We were really clear that there were not any evictions, and that wasn't always helpful to achieve, because we had some really, really challenging behaviour, and the owners of the hotels were not terribly keen. Just one example, we had to deal with a resident at one of our hotels who was found on the roof stealing lead, which really didn't make the hotel management very happy at all. So we had to negotiate quite carefully why that person should stay in the hotel and not being put back onto the streets again. So we had literally hundreds of very challenging incidents, but none of our people were evicted back onto the streets. All have gone into some form of temporary accommodation. There needs to be a move on plan in terms of what happens next. But the next challenge, as I said, the people who don't have those options.
Anything else?
I've got a quick question here. It's Jude.
Go on, Jude.
Sorry, I'm trying to find. I can hear a voice. Who is it? Jude.
Jude.
Yeah, carry on.
I was just wondering, Tom, have you got any support from any of the supermarkets, as it were? It seems like they'd almost be ideally placed to try and contribute as well as the general public.
Yeah, we do actually. We have good relationship with Tesco's, with Waitrose, who provide us with food. Also, a lot of local restaurants have provided us with food throughout the pandemic and did beforehand. So Nando's have a relationship with us, a number of local pizza places as well. So we have a whole series of corporate relationships with providers of food. Yeah, we do.
Cool, it's good to hear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any
You
more?
back to yourself, I think now. Conscious of
Right.
time.
Okay. Well, Tom, thank you for a most interesting summary of a world that most of us know little or nothing about, but which is remarkably close to actually where we live. I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and we'll certainly see what we can do going forward to continue to help.
Thank you.
Please feel free to stay. We would like you to stay at the end. On the other hand, if you've got a pressing need to leave, we will understand that as well.